Perspective on Florida Gateway College Television is sponsored by Potash Corp of White Springs. Potash Corp, helping nature provide.
Hello everyone and welcome to Perspective. This is a public affairs presentation of Florida Gateway College. My name is Mike McKee and my guest on the program is a professor of history at Florida Gateway College. His name is Dr. Sean McMahon. We're going to talk about the 100th anniversary of World War I through some old Lake City reporters. We'll talk to Dr. Sean when we come back. Don't go away.
Recently, our country has witnessed catastrophic devastation. Hurricanes and flooding have upended lives and livelihoods.
Across this great country, Americans have answered the call.
That special calling that compels us when others are down, to step up and do whatever it takes.
America's at her best when, against all odds, we come together and lift each other up.
Please donate to oneamericaappeal.org. America needs you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Perspective on Florida Gateway College Television. My guest is Dr. Sean McMahon, professor of history here at Florida Gateway College. Welcome to the program. It's a first for you.
Mike, it's good to be here. I'm looking forward to sharing with you and with our viewers what I found in some research here at the library.
Now, World War I is started 100 years ago.
It did.
And so you've done some research using some old newspapers on microfiche. Talk
Yes.
a little bit about what's available here.
Absolutely. My topic is the coverage of the war in the Lake City. Back then it was the Citizen Reporter. It was a weekly. And remember, World War I, I'll go through this a little bit. It started in 1914, but the U.S. didn't get involved until 1917. So that's what we're celebrating the anniversary of. And I was able to access it here at the library. Right under the same roof here. We have it on microfilm. You ever read microfilm, Mike? It's kind of a chore.
Sean, it's interesting that you asked that question. It's the 40th anniversary of the United Way of Swanee Valley, and so I went back and looked at newspapers from 1968, which is very interesting because back then the Vietnam War was going on.
Yes.
So it's a great resource, not only for genealogy and,
Yes.
and to trace roots of your family and incidents that happened in the community, but it's also a great. I mean, you've determined that what was going on through newspapers back in 17.
Yes, the old newspapers are really rich. It's a combination of Facebook and Fox News, CNN, whatever your primary news source had all the gossip. I get lost sometimes in the ads and in the movie listings. It's a lot of fun to look at. One thing I wanted to tell researchers that are out there, it's a pretty popular site out here where they have the microfilm. The year 1915 is missing. I couldn't find it. No criticism of the library. We just happen to not have it. There are a few selected issues that have been digitized at the UF library. There's the website, but it's not a comprehensive listing of the newspaper. The farther back you go, the more spotty it is. But I had real solid coverage of World War I and found a lot of interesting stuff.
Now, did you use the actual microfiche here in the library, or did you use the online?
I use a little bit online, but I mostly use it here at the library. It's a great feature. You can scan what you want and save it as a file. So what you're going to be seeing are ads, headlines, etc., that I was able to scan and save to a computer. Let's
look at some of the stuff that you were able to find.
Absolutely. I want to give a little bit of background also on Lake City and Columbia County. This is from the census that I found. So we lost a little population in the county between...
In 10 years.
Yes, 19, that's right.
Now, what do you think this was caused by? Death or?
Probably a little bit of that. People that went overseas. I have the casualty list. We'll do that at the end of the presentation. But a lot of people came here for jobs, and when the war ended, no more jobs. They might have gone back to Alabama or Georgia or wherever. So we did have a little bit of a migration out of the county during that time. We had one large employer here that went through a really difficult time. We'll talk about that as well.
Okay.
The main industries, of course, the railroad, very important, lumber. We had some downtown merchants. All these will be mentioned in the presentation. And of course, farming, very important. And the editor of the paper also was an interesting guy as well. I want to talk to him. Mike, this is a street scene. Now today, as you're going south on Marion, to your right, you would see the Winn-Dixie. right? And on your left you would see the VA, but this is a way it looked around the turn of the century. So to your left,
What is on the left? It looks like maybe a college at one time.
yes, well that was Florida Agricultural College, which was on the current site of the VA. It was there for 22 years. It later became something that you're familiar with, Mike, University of Florida.
And in honor of that, I wore the orange and blue today.
Mike, there you go. They had a big win.
People don't realize that the University of Florida got its start here in 1884 in Lake City.
Yes, absolutely.
And do you know the story of why they moved?
Well, I've heard several different versions. They basically opened it up in 1904. People put in bids to host the college. So can you imagine saying, I can't wait to go to the Gator game in Daytona or in Fernandina? They all put in bids to host the college. To make a long story short, it did move to Gainesville. They trucked the whole campus down on wagons down 41, and it's been in Gainesville ever since 1906.
Since 1906.
Yes.
It's amazing. A lot of people that live here have lived there all their lives and never realized that the VA was the site of the first University of Florida.
Yes, it's relevant to the World War I presentation because the campus sat idle, but it did become a small private college known as Columbia College from 1910. It was used off and on until about 1930. After World War II, of course, it became the VA, which we now have on that site today. There's the tower that you saw in that other picture. This is the administration building of Columbia College. This is important because some of the local doughboys or World War I soldiers are going to train on that campus.
Of course, this building no longer exists.
Unfortunately, Mike, it's all gone. They've torn it all down. The bell from that tower is now in Tallahassee, believe it or not, and one of the buildings is now over on Lehigh Street, which is to the east of the current VA site. That's it, Mike. Unfortunately, everything else has been torn down. It's a tragedy. It was a nice campus at one point. If we get back to the newspaper, the editor there is Herbert Dodd. I didn't find a lot of information on him. He died as a fairly young guy, but worked hard. And they actually had 4 newspapers in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Many cities had multiple print papers at that point. The one that we're concerned with is the Citizen Reporter. It was a weekly published on Fridays, and of course now we know it as what, Mike? The Reporter?
The 1919, right after the war.
Right after the war, it consolidated and became the Reporter, which we now have today. So that's what I was looking at in the library. If we look at World War I, so again, the 100th anniversary of American participation, the war started in 1914, and to make it very simple, the countries in blue were on one side, the countries in red were on another, and it was not entirely clear which side America would be on, but ultimately we joined the Allies, England and France, is where we would be coming into 1917. But the newspaper, of course, was covering it throughout its beginnings in 1914 and found some good stuff there as well.
So the red was the Kaiser?
Yes, the Kaiser. And that's important to know him, right? He was sort of the villain of the war. We'll see him in some of the propaganda. Germany, Austria-Hungary, which is there, Italy, and then some of the Middle Eastern countries as well were on the same side, known as the Central Powers. And then on the other side, if you look at it sort of as 2 teams, then the other side would be England, France, and Russia, which we'll call them the Allies. And of course, that is the side that ultimately America would join in. A couple years after the beginning then, 1917.
This was a nasty war too.
It was. It became really vicious. The technology increased the number of deaths on the battlefield, and it became much, much worse than anyone ever imagined. To compare it then, during the Civil War 50 years earlier, you were a good shot if you could get off 3 shots in a minute. And now in 1914, you have machine guns doing multiple rounds a second. So the destruction was unbelievable.
Yeah, something that humankind had not seen.
Yes.
Especially with the gas warfare as well that was used throughout
You had poison
the war.
gas and other weapons like that, flamethrowers, things like that. It was pretty gruesome. So, you know, early on they're stressing that America needs to be prepared. I think there was a sense that America would get involved, but the Lake City Citizen Reporter is urging Americans to be prepared. What I wanted to focus on, these quotes that I have are ones from Dodd himself. We had national news, of course, from The Wire, but Dodd really was kind of the moral voice of the area as we move through here, right? So even early in 1914, we were comparing the navies. You know, this is August, so right when the war was getting started, you know, there was awareness of which side was stronger, things like that. It wasn't entirely sure where we were going to be, Mike. We were pretty sure we would be with England and France, but there were a lot of German Americans who kind of felt the other way.
But you know, I think a lot of people don't understand when you're talking about the 4 newspapers that were here and the Citizen Reporter here. This is the only way people got their news.
That's correct.
If they didn't socialize in a church setting or maybe the county fair, or
right.
This was the way they got their news.
That's right.
The only way.
Yes, the newspapers were very dense. There's a lot of text there, not a whole lot of pictures, as we'll see. So there was a lot to talk about. There's a lot to take in, right? So Dodd was, even at this point in the fall, Dodd was a very religious man from what I saw, that he said the U.S. should turn to God. We're going to sort of have this religious, moral viewpoint here and do the right thing. And in September, I found a quote where there was a meeting of Jacksonville businessmen in Lake City to discuss business and the war. This is an opportunity for trade, for farmers, for commerce, and the reporter, under the leadership of Dodd, said, "Now is the time," which is the quote that ended that citation there. So be ready, be prepared, see if we can have opportunities. There was farmers were shipping agricultural goods over to the soldiers, etc. Again, there was no 1915 paper, so we'll move on to 1916. And at this point, we're seeing a lot of patriotism, continued emphasis on preparedness and getting ready for war. As a strongly Democratic area, the locals were pretty fond of Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat. He was elected in 1912 and will be reelected in 1916. I found a quote, 1914, praising the wonderful work of Woodrow, right? Woodrow Wilson laid out his accomplishments, and then after he was elected, late 1916, it's ironic because they said he was elected on the peace ticket. He campaigned, we know all about politicians campaigning. He campaigned as a peace candidate, and of course we'll be in the war 6 months later, due to a series of events here. I found an interesting one in December 1916. Herbert Dodd kind of said, well, what will the year 1917 mean to Lake City? And he quotes that we're a community of people with one aim, one ambition, one great purpose in life, to make a more prosperous town and countryside. And Dodd concluded saying, shall we stand or shall we march? So he's kind of, Mike, he's getting ready. I think he's anticipating that war is coming fairly soon. And as we move on through, then the war took kind of a nasty turn. We mentioned the machine guns and the destruction in early 1917, that the war was really becoming very destructive. England and France were losing strength, and I think there's a sense that someone's going to have to step in to save America from the Kaiser, from the Germany and the Central Powers. And Dodd, the editor of the paper, is saying that, you know, we're opposed to war, but we have to recognize that it may very well happen, that America would get involved. Wilson actually declared war in April 1917, and the declaration, I have a headline here coming up in a second, that we were going to war. It's interesting, they said it was going to be mostly at sea, but the land war would come as well. There's an ad I found for the Columbia County Bank. War is on, Mike.
And again, they put in their ads that the Columbia Bank was started in 1912, the year the Titanic sunk.
Ah, that's true. That's true.
And
not a great year.
1917,
yes.
The Lusitania.
Yes, it was around that time, absolutely. So, you know, America's watching this stuff, the war at sea, the war on land, but we're on the sidelines, Mike. Remember, we weren't active until 1917. So we're aware of all the destruction, ships being sunk, et cetera, and so we're going to see in just a second some of the propaganda that was used to show America this is a good thing to get involved in. The newspaper was on target with that as well. Interesting group being targeted by the newspaper here. I found this interesting that they referenced colored people. So there was a lot of respect given to the African American community in Lake City. Mentioned in a couple of headlines here. There was an awareness that they were patriotic. I found one instance in April 1917 where 500 African Americans met at a church on the north side of town, pledged their duty to the country, offered themselves and their services in whatever capacity is needed. They would be in the military, but there were segregated units, in other words, all African American units. They weren't mixed in yet. So you see that in the newspaper as well. I found another headline where it said they joined the Red Cross. And they were a separate community in Lake City, but they were as patriotic and willing to give as anybody else. And I thought that was a real testament to their tight community that they had. If we move on through here, the mayor was quite a colorful guy. A.J. Mosley is what we have here. There was a patriotic meeting in April 1917. It's Dodd, the editor of the paper, said, the crowd was there on a patriotic mission to take the first steps in a movement towards Lake City, doing a creditable part in the war. And on April 11th, Mayor Mosley, believe it or not, Mike, he sent a telegram to President Wilson stating that the citizens of Lake City, quote, endorsed your policies and stand ready to do their duty. Can you imagine sending a tweet or a text to President Trump, for example?
That's basically what it was back in the day. Right. There was a telegram, which was done on telegraph wire.
Yes.
And, before the telephone.
Absolutely, before social media, right? And the equivalent would be Lake City saying, we're ready to help, for example, in North Korea or something, and I'm sure the president would say, what is this? You know, but back then it was a smaller world, and I think he noticed, and as we'll see, a national official will come to Lake City in 1918. He will come right through the town.
Let's move along about the draft. Some
Yes.
people didn't want to, you know,
That's
again,
for sure.
there were some that didn't want the war, there were some that wanted the war, and there were some that didn't want to fight in the war.
Yes.
Because of how horrendous it was. I'm sure the back in the day, they were talking about how bad it was and how mustard gas was used, and people were being burned, and and they were in trenches, and it was cold, and you know.
Right, right. So and America is not threatened by takeover or whatever. We're an ocean away from the war, so why would we want to get involved? So Wilson, though, recognized that we would need a lot of soldiers. It was later revealed that he estimated 1 million soldiers is what they would need. So how are you going to do this and make people feel good about it? The draft is very controversial. It didn't go well during the Civil War, for example.
The draft riots.
There were riots, etc. So we need to call men in to the Army, but we want to sort of do it in a nice way. And what we see is they had local people at the draft centers here. So this is a big headline. Are you going to enlist or be drafted? What they wanted people to do was enlist, go and sign up yourself. And that way you could maybe be with your friends, you might be able to stay local with your training, and it sort of seemed like it wasn't the government reaching in and taking your life away. And that's the way that they ran it here. The draft, at one point, Dodd in the newspaper said the draft seemed Prussian or German. It seems like that's something that the Kaiser would do, forcing you to do things. America's not like that. So, hey, young men in Lake City, Columbia County, go to the courthouse and enlist. And they really encourage people to do that. And they're going to encourage this through the use of the newspaper by listing all the men. So Mike, you can imagine if you saw your friend, your neighbor, your coworker on that list and you weren't on the list, you might say, okay, I need to go to the courthouse. So
they're shaming people into joining.
Absolutely, it's a public thing, and this is make an example. Look at all these fine young men who signed up there.
Let's look at that list again. I mean, because I'm sure if you're a longtime resident of Columbia County, your name, one of your relatives may be on this list.
Absolutely.
And so you could say that grandpa or great-grandfather was drafted back in 1917
That's
to
right.
participate in the war.
There's a full list, and it was very current in there. The newspaper on microfilm was not indexed, so in other words, you can't search for a specific name. You would have to sort of scroll through. But the names are all there, very well tabulated in the paper, etc. At one point, they're monitoring this through Jacksonville, and Mike, I found a story in summer 1917 that said that recruiting officers from Jacksonville came over and screened a few of the men, did health screenings, and it specifically said they came over in an automobile. I mean, Mike, that was big news back then. You know, they came from Jacksonville in a car. Back then, it was pretty rare.
I'm pretty sure I-10 wasn't built. I'm sure US 90 may not have been.
You're talking dirt roads. It may have been a 2-day trip, but they came over, and the continued support of the men who were enlisting was very significant. I found a story in June where it said 350 people registered the first day. Several local businesses, including DeSoto Drugs, Lake City Pharmacy, and Columbia Pharmacy, provided cold drinks. The Boy Scouts were there. The local women brought flowers and a pitcher of lemonade. It said a recruiting camp was established in a tent in the city park, which is now in front of the courthouse. And over this waves Old Glory while the boys keep coming in, rallying to the flag. So one of those drugstores is now Marion Street Cafe. That was the site of a drugstore. So it's all there. You know, we're all downtown. How are we going to sell all this? It's through propaganda. Mike, I think that's my favorite propaganda poster ever. I mean, that poster says it all. You know, do you want this in your backyard? It's a distinctive German helmet on the head of the monster there, and there was this concern that America was in danger. We have to sell this war to people. I found several ads. If we want to keep scrolling through, these are ads for movies showing at the Grand Theater, which is on Marion Street, 1 block north of the Blanche. It's now a church, Mike. It's that one with kind of the awning out in front of it on North Marion. So these are actual ads for a newspaper. War just as it is, right? Showing at the Grand. This is July 1917. So, Mike, people didn't have TVs. You would go to the theater to see footage of the war.
And you'd actually get your news sometimes from the newsreels that would
Correct.
go before the movie.
I think that's one difference. Today the news goes to you. It goes to your device, your phone, your tablet, where you are. Back then you had to go to the theater to get news like this, right? This is all about men who were drafted. serving at the Grand. Admission was 25 cents, Mike, so that was, you know, a pretty big expense there if you want to spend the money to go to the war. I think the matinee was 15 cents, full night show was a quarter, so they're spending some big bucks here. All kinds of dramatic shows here. These were silent movies, right? So you're looking at the footage, you have a piano player watching these movies here. One of my favorites here is this says, if you're an alien, in other words, if you're a German, don't even go to this movie. Just stay away. This is about the Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin. You know, so we don't even want any Germans in the theater. We want Americans looking at how horrible this guy was, and that's motivating Americans to serve in the war. Great stuff. There were, of course, instances of local patriotism as well. Mike, one of my favorite stories was in June 1917. A man named J.M. Smith built a model of a battleship in his front yard, decorated it with American flags. Mike, overnight, someone burned his model to the ground, and it says, quote, he was of the opinion that some weak-minded German sympathizer did the incendiary work. So there were instances of vandalism, you know, getting in the way of this patriotism effort as we move on through here.
You know, the more things are, they stay the same. I
Yes,
mean, basically
of course.
The same things are happening.
Right.
The same things happened in the Vietnam War.
Sure.
Same things happen with Afghanistan and things
Sure.
like that. So
wars are polarizing, and you're going to have people on both sides of it. Absolutely. One of the things that they wanted local people to do, this is another ad from the paper, was to buy bonds. So in other words, you gave money to the government to spend on the war effort, and then you got a very sort of low interest return on it. There was a lot of these ads in the paper to buy bonds. There were other things about you know, using different types of things at home save the things for the war effort, etc. I like this one too, wartime sweeteners, right? So the good stuff goes to the soldiers. You have to sacrifice at home and do without, so that the soldiers in the trenches would have what they needed. There was one more here, it's about Lake City women as well. Very active, Mike. The women were truly on the home front here, and were giving things such as recitals of patriotic music. The wife of the publisher actually had women over at their house to knit covers for soldiers' helmets, etc. Just a way to keep people, you know, safe and active and feel like they're participating in the war effort is what we have here. Women workers, of course, if all the men were going to the war, Mike, who is going to staff the factories and the you know, the stores, etc. It would be women doing it back at the home front. And there was a huge ad, I couldn't even get it all in the newspaper, from the Watertown Mill, which is not far from here in the college, out in the forest.
by Watertown Lake.
Yes, absolutely. That's where they floated all the logs out there. Well, very busy during the war, but then a lot of the men left once they were enlisting or being drafted. So an ad went out to draft who's going to work at Watertown. It's going to have to be women. They called out to women to come and work at the mill. It says, quote, what hurts Watertown hurts us. If the big mill at Watertown is compelled to close down, it will mean a big loss to business establishments of the city. Think this matter over carefully, women of Lake City, then get together and take up the matter in the right way, cooperate.
And back then, women did not work.
That's correct.
This was
right.
You know, something that was really off script.
Yes.
Was women actually were in the workplace.
We think of sort of Rosie the Riveter type. This is going on during World War I as well. Yeah, they were very busy. In the final segment, I did want to talk about the sort of the boys who went over. You know, we absolutely did have men who served, and unfortunately that meant casualties. And they listed them all. It was a small town, small paper. The first one listed was, the first casualty was August, and then the second one was in November 1917. I thought this was interesting as well. We talked about gas. It says, local boy gassed by the Huns. Right, that was in August 1918. He suffered a poison gas attack. Right there in the trenches. Horrible weapons that they had out there in the battlefield. I decided to take kind of a micro view of one local soldier, a very prominent name here. His name is Baugh, who joined the 13th Company 2nd Infantry Regiment. This is his draft card, which I found on the State Archives website from Tallahassee. That's his actual card that listed his information, his hometown, where he was born, his unfortunate date of death, etc. These are all through the archives website. But then back to the newspaper, this is a listing of him dying over there. He died of pneumonia, very sad, late in the war, and they reached out to the local families and really wanted them to sort of grieve as a community when these boys died.
And the reference to "over there" was a song back then.
Yes,
that was
a patriotic song during the war.
About your boys are going over there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and then we had a local guy who died. These boys who signed up and wanted to enlist and stay local, we actually had a local infantry regiment. A large and enthusiastic crowd, it says, June 1917, assembled at the courthouse to bid Godspeed to our fine, true-hearted boys. Mike, they had a picnic supper and a fish fry, so how can you go wrong with that? Very good support for Company C. They actually housed them at the campus, you know, the former UF campus, Columbia College campus, and the coverage of it was great. They were very excited about them. Dodd and the newspaper were so proud of them to come over. You know, this is a good thing. These guys are training with their friends. They're staying local. They swam in the pool at the college. They marched out. They would be facing Baugh Avenue as they went out there and trained. But of course, ultimately, Mike, they have to go off to war. And I wanted to go through their farewell, which is in September 1917. It says 5,000 people went to the train station, which was up at Railroad and Marion, up in that area. 5,000 people. They sang songs, they had food. Mike, the patriotic ladies of Lake City prepared a luncheon of substantial meat sandwiches and hot coffee, which they served to the soldiers and bid them on their farewell. Substantial, Mike, is what it says. Right, absolutely. I have another quote. It says, during their stay at the train station, a number of the soldiers were heard to call out, "Hey, Captain, can't we get a furlough and come back to Lake City?" So, I mean, I think they had a great visit here. And the pastor of First Baptist Church gave them a blessing, and they were on their way. This is what they were trained to do. They stayed local, but ultimately they went off to the trenches. Over they go. So, tough time.
Yeah, and we're going to have to wrap this up. Armistice Day was the day the war ended, November 11th.
Yes.
It is still celebrated as Veterans Day.
It is, Veterans Day. I've got a headline here. This is it, November 1918. It says the Germans capitulate. And we had the celebration of it. It's been expanded to honor all veterans, as I see. Big celebration in Lake City during that day. And Lake City really did a tremendous service during the war. The jollification says there was a celebration. There was a celebration all through town.
Well, this is interesting stuff. This is taught at Florida Gateway College.
Of course it is, absolutely.
And you're one of our history instructors who
Yes.
Does this class. What other classes do you teach out here?
I generally only do the early American history survey and the modern American history survey.
And so what is modern? When I was in school,
Modern
was, you know, so
Yep.
how far do you go in modern?
Other people do it differently. We talked about Mr. Mont. Mr. Mont would go all the way up to the present. What I can generally do is Ronald Reagan, you know, in the 80s, because I spent a lot of time on the older stuff, but I try to get as modern as I can.
Now, how early does the history class start? What is the earliest?
The end of the Civil War, 1865, is when the modern one starts.
Okay, and anything before that goes all to the
early
Revolutionary?
U.S. history course, right?
So,
We do from the Native Americans, Christopher Columbus, all the way up to the Civil War in the early part, AMH 2010.
you know, would someone in the community benefit by taking this as an audit class, maybe?
Of course.
Just come learn a little bit about history?
Sure.
Maybe a refresher course?
Sure, I would welcome anybody to come out and sit in on the class, participate in the discussions. I have a Vietnam veteran in one of my classes this semester, older gentleman, so there's no age limit to learning. If you're ready to go, we'll teach you.
All right, Sean McMahon is Professor of History here at Florida Gateway College. Thank you for being here, and we'll look forward to doing these again.
Thanks, Mike, great to be here.